Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you just shove a bunch of random things into your head and shake it up and something spills out.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Beyond the Manuscript. As always, I am your host, Cooper Anderson, coming to you from my very own library pocket dimension here. Before we get into it today, Beyond the Manuscripts is, of course, currently available everywhere you find podcasts. And if you like what I do here, hit that like, subscribe, follow, all of the buttons. It absolutely helps out the channel and lets me keep doing what I love, which is talk to you lovely people about books. Okay, so let's get into it. My guest today is a notable science fiction author with nearly 100 works published. He is featured in Analog Daily Science Fiction and is the recipient of the L. Ron Hubbard's Writer of the Future Award. Recently, he has transitioned into the world of publishing, launching Farthest Star Publishing in the hopes to provide a platform for emerging sci-fi, fantasy, and horror writers. Please help me welcome my guest, David D'Amico. How are we doing today, David?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being a guest here on the show. I'm excited. I'm always really interested in seeing the more of the behind the scenes stuff when it comes to the world of publishing. So I'm really curious to pick your brain. And so to kind of just jump right into it, can you tell us all about Farthest Star Publishing? How did it get started? What are your goals, etc.?
I started Father Star Publishing in hopes to give voice to stories that are outside the traditional size limits of most markets. A lot of markets in science fiction and fantasy today, they have caps around 5,000 words. Um, there's a lot of good stories that can't even get started at 5,000 words, but they're not big enough to be novels. They're somewhere in what I call the lost formats, the novellas. There's very few markets that handle stories 10,000, 15,000 words. And out of those markets, almost none of them will take reprints. Um, I have no problem with reprints. I think a lot of the markets that bigger stories have been sold in, and a lot of markets in general, don't get a wide audience. So I'm looking to get those stories, those fantastic stories that are really hard to sell. I'm looking to get those and promote them either in anthologies or in standalone books. I'm looking to showcase people who don't get seen enough.
Awesome. I think it's a great goal to have. And so what is it specifically about like sci-fi, fantasy, horror genres that you wanted to work in?
Well, I've been a sci-fi reader since before Star Wars, since way back, and it's my genre of choice to read and watch on TV or movies. So it seemed natural for me to get into it when I started writing. I write a lot of science fiction. I write some fantasy. I dabbled in horror. I tried mystery horribly, but I have sold about 100 stories. Everything short. I've tried writing novels. I can't do it. So I'm embracing the short form, and I'm hoping to help others embrace it.
Cool. What's your process then for getting a short story? Does it start with a scene? Does it just start with a random idea? Tell me how to, for you, where does a story start and how do you know when you're finished with it?
Well, the story always tells you when it's finished. Um, but for starting, it could be anything. It could be walking down the street and see a dog run by, and it's like, what if that dog weren't really a dog? Or at the coffee shop and hear a piece of somebody's conversation. I misheard somebody talking at one point, and I thought they said something like "boo saying goo," and it's like that's not English. But I turned that into an alien, and I wrote a story that sold off of just not hearing somebody correctly.
Yeah, very good. I always admire that kind of creative process of the combination of just, different pieces of different people's lives, and then that little added spark of imagination on of basically what if, right? Like you said, like what if that dog wasn't actually a
What
dog,
if?
or what if the person at the coffee shop was, an actual alien, and they're having a conversation in an alien language. And so that's it's really interesting to see, just where these ideas kind of come from when we ourselves don't really know specifically. They're just kind of these combinations that kind of fit together like the gears inside of a watch, kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you just shove a bunch of random things into your head and shake it up and something spills out.
When it comes to publishing, from wanting, to have your own stuff published to wanting to publish other people's stories, that's a really big leap. And so, what inspired you to form, Farthest Star, and actually, make that leap from writer to publisher?
Publishing, writing is a very solitary endeavor. And as a writer, I have sympathy for the submission process and how easily you could be rejected and just tossed aside. um, at Father, I started publishing because I wanted to collaborate with others. I wanted to see how others wrote stories, and I wanted to add them to um, my list of stories, and I wanted to see how they would um, deal with different themes. And like I said, I always wanted to find a home for stories that didn't quite fit the size limits. There's so many people out there writing great stories that they can't get published, and I feel their pain.
Do you have, and now that you're on the, let's say, the other side of the metaphorical desk, as it were, do you have a particular story in mind where you're like, oh, I really love this, and I know this couldn't sell in today's current market, and then that gets you kind of jazzed up to actually go get it out there. But do you remember that a particular story where you were like, oh, this is exactly what I'm looking for?
I found a few stories that showcase what I'm looking to do. Um, the recent anthology I started putting together, Leadership Gone Right, um, I got a few stories that were well outside the size limits that I established. I established an 8,000 word cap. I got a couple of stories that were 10, 11, 12,000 words. I still read them. I accepted a couple of them because, those are the stories I want. I had a cap in mind for the anthology because I wanted to fit a certain number of stories in, but I I made leeway for good stories of any size.
Hmm. I think, because I mentioned this earlier with a couple of other interviews I've done in the past, where we're kind of phasing out of the time in the world of books where we have this like mysterious reclusive author to where all they have to do is write, a fantastic book, and they, get to go live on their ranch somewhere in the middle of nowhere and not interact with an audience, not grow, not market, not interview, et cetera, et cetera. Like, so when you don't have that kind of author anymore, there comes more rejection. And so the idea that, to be an author, you also now have to have one really thick skin for rejection, and then also a whole bunch of other skills. Like you have to learn how to market, you have to learn how to talk to people, you have to give a good interview, you have to be in the public light a bit.
That is definitely true. You can't just submit a story and let it all happen around you. Nowadays, a lot of markets, at least the smaller ones for books and stories, they want to know what your marketing plan is for your story. They want to know um, how many followers you have on different platforms. It's like stuff that nobody asked me when I started writing. It's like followers, what's that? Marketing plan, that's your job. But a lot of these places, in order to even look at your manuscript, they want to know what you plan to do to market it. And for some people, way too much because writers are solitary. They're on the outskirts sometimes. You know, in order to have all these big thoughts, you have to have a little world, at least for some people. um, so it's difficult. It's very difficult.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier about taking in submissions for Farthest Star. Can you tell me a little bit more about the open submissions process for Farthest Star right now, and what specifically are you looking for?
We read blind. We prefer not to have any author details on the stories that we get because that way the story is the important thing. You know, we get to read the story with no preconceived notions. We don't want to know that you've gotten 15 Oscars for writing great science fiction stories because you know this might not want to be one of them. It's all about the story first, and then we'll talk to the people.
Gotcha. So you mentioned a little bit before that you have coming out in April an anthology called Leadership Gone Right. What can you tell us about it?
It's an anthology with a theme about leadership, inspiring leadership, um, or maybe not inspiring leadership. You know, leaders that their people think they're crazy, but at the end they prove to be right. Somebody who's got a vision that nobody else can see, you know, an inner strength. And I've gotten a lot of good stories around that theme. We've completed the story submission process. I'm editing the stories right now. We'll be choosing a cover soon, and it'll be available for pre-order probably at the beginning of March. I'm very excited because this is our first anthology. It exceeded expectations with the amount of stories we've gotten and the amount of good stories we got.
And so, as an editor, because you're doing the editing yourself, what particular elements in a story do you really look for? Like, what you like? Oh, if I discovered this in a story, that means I know it's gonna either pay off or it's gonna be really good by the end of it.
The writing's going to be competent to start with. You got to have a grasp of the grammar and the regular stuff. Um, but it's the way they get into a story. My preference is like the first line has to be really good, it's really strong. If you see a strong first line, you know that the story is going to be strong throughout, or at least you have that hope. Some people don't know exactly where to start a story. I had one person submit a story to me where it was a great story, except the whole first scene was completely unnecessary. But the rest of the story was so good. I sent them an email and I asked, you know, would you consider losing the first scene? Because if you do, I'll buy the story because, you know, it was a good story. It just had that bulk at the beginning that wasn't really necessary. Some people get a little carried away or they don't know exactly where to start a story, but they do know how to finish one. That's, I think, one of the hardest parts for new writers to understand. It's okay to throw away some words.
What do you wish writers or new writers knew about publishing when they first try to get their story published?
New writers should read some of the publications that they submit to, get a feel for what they're looking for, um, read the guidelines, always read the guidelines. It's funny, our guidelines are clearly posted in several places, and still probably about 30% of the stories I got didn't follow. I didn't I didn't judge the stories based on that, but still, it's a little annoying. And I know there's a lot of publishers out there that complain about things like that, where people don't read the guidelines; they just send stories wild. And you know, I guess that's one of the ways to do it. Just throw everything out there and see what sticks. But authors, publishers will see that, editors will see that, and they'll have second thoughts about you if you just start throwing anything at them.
Uh, so, what is Farthest Star's plans for after the anthology? What are you guys gonna do after that?
After the anthology, um, we're starting up a second anthology called tentatively titled portals, gateways, and doors. Magical realm. Places you can go from one place to another instantaneously, either in mind or body. It doesn't matter. Just something that's close to that theme. I'd like to have two anthologies a year running, so this will be our second. And I'd like to expand the catalog for our novellas. I just started putting together some longer works, but I plan on having a large catalog of 8 to 15,000 word stories that people can purchase cheaply, that they can read in an evening, afternoon. They can get a whole bunch of them and put them together and make their own anthology out of them. Um, but I'd like to start purchasing novellas this year. How many? It depends on funding, but we'll probably find as many homes as we can for longer works, things that people have a hard time selling.
I think this is probably one of the bigger potential room for publishing to grow is with, like you said, like novella length stuff, because of certain platforms like ebooks or Kindles or whatever. Because before the invention of like ebooks, it was almost impossible to sell like a novella. Like you know, the unless your name was Stephen King or like Neil Gaiman or something, nobody was going to buy them because nobody really pays money for a tiny little booklet of a novella unless it's part of, like you said, a part of a bigger anthology. But now with things like Kindle Unlimited or whatever, it's much easier to, I think anyway, for people to access those kinds of stories. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to publish shorter works, and there's more of a market for them. Some people are voracious readers, and a lot of them don't want to get caught up in an epic quest of some kind if they're not sure of who the writer is. These are what I consider these novellas is advertising for larger works. If the author is working on novels and stuff, this is a primer. I get to see the author's style and how they write a story without investing $20 in a novel or buying a large anthology just to read this one author. I can just get this story and see what it's like.
Yeah. Exactly, and I quite like that, the economy of story at that point. Because you're right, because it's really asking a lot for someone to get into something like the Wheel of Time, the Stormlight Archive, these huge, huge tomes of a novel where if you, let's say you get 100 pages in and it's just not for you, you tend to feel guilty a little bit. And you're like, all right, I spent $20 on this book. There's 500 pages. I'm a fifth of the way through, and I'm just not into it. I don't like it. However, if you spend $2 on a digital copy of a novella, it's 20 pages, and you end up liking it. There's only like room for potential. And if not, you're not, if it's just not your thing, whatever story you bought, then like you said, you don't have a whole lot of guilt attached to it.
Yeah, that's where we're going with this. We'd like it to be more. We'd like to make works more accessible, cheaper, easier for people to read many different authors to get a feel for what's out there. Because now you go to a bookstore, there's only so many authors they can display, and it's the usual big ones. You don't see new emerging voices. You don't get to know diverse people that may not have anything else out there, but might in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you tell us a little bit more about the fracture?
The fracture. That's a shared universe that I'm developing that I'd like to put out there for writers to become a part of. I have a basic canon. I have a land with territories and peoples, and I'd like to populate that with characters from other authors because I've always been fascinated about how two people can see the exact same thing and take away something completely different from it. It's just amazing when you see people writing the same story and it's nowhere near the same. It's the same people, it's the same scenery, but they're completely different motivations, completely different lives, and I love that so much. I've been involved in a lot of shared universes. I've sold quite a few stories in shared universes, and it's one of my favorite things. So I thought I'd try bringing it out to the public from this platform, something where I can expand it and not so much control it, but guide it.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's kind of you're setting up a sandbox and you're inviting other kids to come play in it, right?
Yes, exactly.
And if you want to, do you want to talk a little bit more about like the actual lore of the fracture, like what's going on? What's this big unifying thing in this shared universe that you're trying to share with the world?
Well, we're still in its development stages, but the basic concept is in the north of this land, technology rules. In the south of the land, magic rules. And there's a gradient where technology fails and magic fails till they get to a point called the parity in the middle, where magic and technology, neither one of them work. But there's a gradient where things work at different levels. I've got an explanation for how it works. It's technical for some reason, but it lends this world lends itself to your high magic stories, your steampunk science fiction stories, and then when you get closer to the parody and things don't work, you get the weird West, you get the Arabian Nights. It goes through quite a different list of subgenres in the same world with people interacting and mixing in these cultures.
Very cool. That sounds honestly, that sounds really really interesting, and I can't wait to hear more about it when it starts getting a little bit more developed. Sweet. Okay, so you have mentioned, your anthologies that are going to come out this year, your immediate goals of wanting to buy more novellas, but for you, what are your further out publishing goals for Farthest Star?
My goals that I've had for most of my writing life has been to try to give something back. I don't know quite what that looks like yet, but I'd like to have the ability to give something back, some kind of scholarship, reward, something something to encourage new writers.
All right. Well, David, we are running out of time here. So, my final question, as always, where can people find your stuff?
Well, we're on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, the usual suspects. We'll be putting a shop onto the website, www.fartheststar.com, fartheststarpublishing.com, and we'll be selling the books through there. We'll be selling the books at local conventions, and I'm going to try to get us into a few local bookstores and try to branch out from there.
Yeah. And just so everyone knows, there's going to be links, of course, to everything in the description down below, as always. All right. Well, that is going to do it for us today here at Beyond the Manuscript. Of course, powered by Manuscripts, where you never write alone. I want to thank my guest, David D'Amico, for coming on the show today. David, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.